Hey there, gang, it's me, Garrett. I'm here to talk to you today about schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. Now, this rainbow coalition of disorders is on a spectrum, which means it can be difficult to tell the difference exactly between each category of diagnosis. What that means basically is, like a rainbow, even though it's hard to tell the exact difference between orange or yellow because there's a gradient between, that doesn't mean that orange and yellow don't exist and are categories we can talk about when we're talking about colors. But telling the difference can be difficult, so it's important to pay really good attention to the things that make these disorders different. Usually that's going to be time of illness and severity of illness. We'll find more about that as we talk about each category. All of these disorders have some things in common. These symptoms can be found in almost all of these. So let's go ahead and take a look now. First off is delusions. These are fixed beliefs that are immune or resistant to change. You can give someone with a delusion more and more evidence and argue and try to prove a point, but they will not change their mind. It's a fixed delusion. Delusions come in lots of different categories. Let's take a look. First off is persecutory. This is the belief that other people want to hurt you, steal from you, or otherwise abuse you in some way. This could be people that you don't know or people that you trust. Maybe someone that's really close to you that you are trusting with your money.
It was you, Joe.
There's also grandiose delusions, which is the belief that one is more important than, or more wealthy than, or more powerful than they might actually be in life. Erotomanic. An erotomanic belief is the idea that someone you're in love with loves you back. Usually that someone is famous, and there's no real reason to think that they might love you back. Nihilistic delusions are the belief that the world's going to end or some big catastrophe is going to hurt lots of people around them, and including the person. And this is the common doomsday delusion. Jealous delusions are the belief that your spouse or partner are cheating on you. A referential delusion is the belief that someone's gestures, speech, or actions is directed at you when it isn't.
What the hell else are you talking? You talking to me?
Somatic delusions are the belief that something is wrong with the body. This could be thinking that you have a foul odor that everyone else can smell, or that there's parasites on or underneath your skin. Not all delusions fit neatly within these categories, and there's the condition for other delusions that you could use to describe delusions that aren't included here. There's also mixed delusions, which feature themes from a lot of these other different kinds of delusions we just talked about. Likewise, you might want to specify if the delusions are bizarre, which means that the person hasn't had any interactions with this kind of delusion. For example, a common somatic delusion is a parasite. A bizarre somatic delusion is that the parasite is an alien that's going to burst out of their chest. It's something that they've never encountered before in their life, and there's no plausible reason to think that it could possibly happen to them. People with these disorders often feature signs of hallucinations, commonly auditory hallucinations, but also visual, olfactory, and gustatory hallucinations. A common feature is disorganized speech. This is talking in a way that is jumbled or confused or doesn't quite communicate the point that the speaker is trying to make. It features signs of derailment, losing one's train of thought, or tangential thinking, changing topics as you speak. Grossly disorganized and abnormal motor behavior can manifest a lot of different ways. It can range all the way from just sudden agitation to acting kind of silly for no reason. Catatonia is marked by a lack of interaction with your environment. This could be remaining completely still when things are happening around you. That's called stupor. It could also be not talking when others are talking to you, mutism. It could be extra movement that's not necessary for anything, catatonic excitement. It could also be a resistance to questions or instructions given. That's called negativism.
I'm not sure I understand. Could you make that clearer for me?
No.
Negative symptoms are often present in some of these disorders, but most prominently in schizophrenia. They include symptoms like anhedonia, not enjoying anything, asociality, not seeking to talk to people, avolition, not motivating oneself to do anything with their time. Also included is diminished emotional expression. That's a very flat affect or very flat tones of speech. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of these disorders. First off is schizotypal personality disorder, which is not included in this section of the DSM. It's over in the personality disorders section, but it is part of the schizophrenia spectrum, so keep that in mind. The first delusion we'll be really talking about is delusional disorder. This is the belief in one of the several delusions we talked about earlier. It's marked by a belief in one or more of such of those delusions. The other part is that it's limited to delusional disorders. And there's a caveat here that is allowing it to include hallucinations, but only if they support the delusions that are central to this diagnosis.
Barney, give this guy a cigarette. He's freaking out. Huh? Who? Barney. He's the guy who tipped me off to Pepe Sylvia. Barney? Who the hell is Barney? You don't see Oh, shit. What the hell did he...
Also included are making sure that it's not caused by medications or other medical diseases, and that the person is functionally impaired because of their delusional beliefs. It's important to remember that this should be happening outside of a mood disturbance, or at least mostly outside of a mood disturbance. After you've met the criteria, you'll need to specify what kind of delusion is this, and that's included in the list we talked about earlier. Again, from that list you pick one, or it's a mixed delusion, other for one that's not listed, and include if it's a bizarre delusion or not. You'll also need to specify after 1 year of being diagnosed if the person is in their first acute episode, if they're partially recovered from that acute episode, fully recovered from that acute episode, or at some point in one of the latter episodes. You'll also want to specify if they're continuous, meaning that they are continuing to show acute symptoms throughout. There is no remission period. You might want to include unspecified if you don't know the client's history, which is quite common. You can specify severity with the use of a chart with 5 different rankings for severity across several different symptoms that are recorded for the most severe symptom in the last 7 days. You don't need to do this chart, but it can help you specify how intense these symptoms are for the client. It's important to remember for delusional disorder that the sole symptom should be delusional ideations. Everything else should be part of that diagnosis. If there's a predominant mood episode, you should be looking at the bipolar or major depressive disorder. If there's symptoms like grossly disorganized motor behavior or catatonia or negative symptoms, you might be looking at one of the other diagnoses. Take note of what is acceptable belief and not acceptable belief given the person's culture. In the Catholic Church, they say that they are eating flesh and blood of Jesus every Sunday. We don't believe that's a delusional disorder. That's just an expression of their faith. Oftentimes, delusional disorder is able to operate outside of their delusional beliefs. However, those delusional beliefs might be causing them to do bizarre things, like sending out thousands of letters to someone that they think loves them, or trying to start an online campaign against a persecutory target for their delusional beliefs. There are disorders that can be more specific or better suited to certain delusions. For example, obsessive compulsive disorder features certain beliefs about why they have to do those compulsive actions. If that person doesn't have any insight into why they are committing those actions, it would probably be better to call it OCD without insight. Likewise, if someone has a body dysmorphic disorder that's causing them to behave a certain way because of a body dysmorphic belief, but they don't have any insight why they're doing this, it might be better to say that they have body dysmorphic disorder without insight. Next up is brief psychotic disorder. This disorder is typified by a very abrupt change from normal to psychotic for a short period between 1 day and 1 month, and then a complete recovery. The criteria are as follows. It must have one or more of the following 4 criteria. At least one of them has to be the first 3. Those are hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, behavior that is grossly disorganized, or catatonic. The duration of this behavior has to be more than a day and less than a month. It also features a full return to the pre-morbid level of function. That means they function as well as they did before they had this episode. Lastly, it must not have a better explanation as schizophrenia or psychotic disorder due to medication or drugs, or mood disorders like major depression or bipolar disorder. You'll need to specify if it comes with marked stressors, events that you or I or anyone might consider extremely stressful, or without marked stressors, happening for almost no reason. You'll also include if it happens during or shortly after pregnancy. And we'll be specifying if the person does have catatonia. And lastly, we'll be specifying how severe these symptoms are. We can do this with a severity scale that includes 5 different points of severity for a variety of symptoms, all measured at their highest that they have been in the last 7 days. This is the same table you'll use for several other diagnoses within this section. The onset needs to be very quick. The space between normal behavior and full psychosis should be no longer than 2 weeks. And once that psychosis begins, it should last no longer than 1 month. You can see Jason Russell here having what was one of the worst public episodes of brief psychotic behavior. This was brought on by a tremendous amount of stress after his charity effort imploded sometime in 2012. Here's Jason again after he made a full recovery.
I remember running around our lemon tree. I remember...
There were reports that were you breaking into cars?
There are reports.
People who are suffering from this disorder usually need some sort of intervention to keep them safe, so they don't hurt others or get hurt by others by provoking them. They also pose a significant risk of suicide to themselves, and they typically stop bathing or eating regularly and might need help addressing those issues. This disease affects twice as many women as it does men, and brief psychosis seems to last longer in certain developing countries. Certain personality disorders might make someone more likely to have this disorder. That includes borderline personality disorder and obviously schizotypal personality disorder. There's also certain traits that might lead someone to develop this diagnosis. 2 diagnoses that are very close to this one and might be difficult to tell apart include drug or medically induced psychosis, which you would test against by seeing if there's anything in their blood work. It also helps to understand that this is only 1 day to 1 month, which separates it from many of the other psychotic disorders. Next up is schizophreniform disorder, which is very much like schizophrenia, only that it is between 1 month long and 6 months long. Now the criteria are as follows. It must have 2 or more of the following symptoms. At least 1 symptom must be from the first 3. Those first 3 are delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. The other 2 are disorganized or catatonic behaviors and negative symptoms. That's the lack of doing things. Episodes must be longer than a month and shorter than 6 months. If the client hasn't made a recovery in any form since, you'll also specify that it's a provisional diagnosis. That means temporary. You'll need to rule out schizoaffective disorder by noting that there is not any mood disorder elements included, or if those mood elements are present, that they're only briefly present compared to the more psychotic behaviors. Lastly, you want to make sure that it's not due to a substance issue or a medical condition. You'll have to specify if it has good prognostic features or bad prognostic features. Well, okay, not bad, but without good prognostic features. Good prognostic features are a steep decline in function level, usually within 4 weeks, and having a good pre-morbid, that means before illness, level of function. That might lead them to have a better recovery quicker. The longer it takes for psychotic symptoms to develop, the more likely that they will not resolve in a short period of time, or maybe at all. You'll specify if they have catatonia, and you'll specify the severity. Again, 5-point scale, last 7 days, whichever point was worse, you'll mark. Schizophreniform delusion shares many features with schizophrenia, and it really serves as an intermediary diagnosis between brief psychotic disorder and full-form schizophrenia. That 1 month to 6 month period is very important. Unfortunately, most people diagnosed with schizophreniform disorder will go on to have a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia. That's 2/3 of people that are diagnosed almost. 1/3 will make a decent recovery within that 6 month period. It carries the same genetic risks that you would expect from schizophrenia. The closer a relative is with this disease, the more likely it is that you might develop this disease. So siblings, parents could be very high risk factors. Cousins or uncles could be more remote risk factors. The differential diagnoses here are that it's a 1 month to 6 month period. Any shorter and it's brief psychosis. Any longer and it's probably schizophrenia. You also want to rule out any mood disorders like major depressive disorder or mood disorder with psychotic symptoms. Next we have schizophrenia, one of the larger entries in this section of the DSM. The way you can tell this disorder apart from other psychotic disorders is the prevalence of negative symptoms, meaning that they're not doing some things, and the severe impact to their function level. We'll talk more about it right now in criteria. Criteria A, they must be presenting 2 or more of the following symptoms, one of which must be the first 3. delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. Also included is grossly disorganized and catatonic behavior and negative symptoms. Again, one of those big things we talked about. They must have a significant impact to their function level. They are no longer able to do the things at work or socially or otherwise that they used to be able to do. They must show signs of continuous disturbance for at least 6 months. Otherwise, this could be classified as schizophreniform. This 6-month period needs at least 1 month or less, if treated, of active symptoms, so actively psychotic for at least a month. Then during the 6-month course, they have some symptoms that are present, but maybe in a lessened form. That could be odd perceptions of what's happening around them, or strange beliefs, but not quite delusional beliefs. You have to rule out schizoaffective disorder, so saying that there's not been present mood disturbances while those acute symptoms are present. Or if there are mood disturbances, that they're brief considering the length of the psychotic symptoms that you're seeing. You'll have to rule out drugs or other medical conditions. You can do that with lab work or medical examination. Lastly, if there's a history of autism, you need to make sure that hallucinations and delusions are significantly present. Autism can have disorganized speech and grossly disorganized behavior, so you need to add delusions and hallucinations to be sure that this is schizophrenia and not autism. You'll need to specify where they are in the course of their illness. Is it their first episode or one of the later ones? Is it acute, partially remitted, or fully remitted? And maybe it's continuous. You could write unspecified if you don't know where they are in the course of their illness. You'll want to specify if they have catatonic symptoms, and you'll want to specify how severe it is using that chart from earlier. Some of the things that can help you understand that this is actually schizophrenia might be a long prodromal phase. This could begin as early as childhood, but typically in early teens. This would feature lots of negative symptoms, not wanting to do anything, not wanting to socialize, not having any energy to get out of their house. Then they have a psychotic episode. This prodromal phase could also include lots of beliefs that aren't exactly delusional, but are peculiar. People with schizophrenia often have poor cognitive abilities, so you'll be looking for that to make sure that this isn't one of the other psychotic disorders. Some additional features that aren't criteria for schizophrenia is increase in agitation. They might be more hostile towards others, more guarded or defensive, but not necessarily more violent. People with schizophrenia are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. They also feature poor insight into their condition, often denying their illness anywhere they can, perhaps denying that they're experiencing symptoms or hearing voices or that they have delusional beliefs. They might even go so far as to accuse you of having delusional beliefs for talking to them about delusional beliefs. People with schizophrenia often have a bad theory of mind. They can't quite interpret what other people are saying, at least not intuitively, and certainly not easily. Schizophrenia is present somewhere between 0.3 and 0.7% of the population. Schizophrenia can have a long prodromal phase that begins early in development, but typically the first acute psychotic episodes occurs in the mid-teens to early 20s. It's later for women than it is for men. The psychotic symptoms tend to remit with age, but the cognitive deficits tend to remain. Later age onset is an area for further investigation, and very late stage onset, after the 50s, could be an entirely different diagnosis. The risk for schizophrenia is correlated with heredity. Having a remote relative with schizophrenia increases the likelihood of having schizophrenia yourself. Having an immediate relative with schizophrenia makes it even more likely that you might develop schizophrenia yourself. People with schizophrenia tend to have a very significant impact in their life. They're not able to do many of the things that they used to be. Not in work, not socializing, not in their parental life, their partner life. These are all things that are going to be greatly diminished by their illness. Even people with the cognitive ability to work, play, socialize, usually don't have the interest in doing any of that due to the anhedonia, avolition, or other negative symptoms. You can tell schizophrenia apart from schizoaffective disorder by noting the occurrence of mood disorder. If mood is majorly present throughout psychotic symptoms, this could be schizoaffective disorder. If it's only briefly or remotely present, well, it's probably schizophrenia. You can also tell the difference between schizophrenia and autism by noting if there's delusions and hallucinations. Remember, autistic people also have signature signs that are included with schizophrenia, and that includes disorganized behavior or disorganized speech. Sadly, people with schizophrenia do have diminished health outcomes. 5% of people with schizophrenia commit suicide. 20% attempt to commit suicide. Even more verbalized a desire to commit suicide. More than that, people with schizophrenia tend to adopt unhealthy behaviors. That could include smoking, poor diet, lack of doctor visits, all of this adding up to a lowered life expectancy. Schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia seem to be very close. The main difference is schizoaffective will have stronger mood components than schizophrenia. Let's go ahead and take a look at the criteria. Criteria A of schizophrenia is basically the same thing. Criteria A of schizoaffective disorder is exactly the same as schizophrenia, except that a major mood disorder must be present during the course of that schizophrenia criteria. Psychotic symptoms, again, delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. The active psychotic symptoms must be concurrent with active mood disturbances, so that could be bipolar or depression. Someone with schizoaffective needs to have delusions or hallucinations 2 weeks prior or 2 weeks after those mood disturbances that are typical to bipolar or depression. Symptoms that are present for mood disorders should also be present throughout the residual and active phase of schizoaffective disorder. Lastly, for criteria, you'll need to rule out medication or illness as a cause. You'll need to specify if the schizoaffective disorder is bipolar or depressive type. Specify if the person is suffering with catatonia, and you'll need to specify where in the course of their illness that they currently are. You'll also want to specify the severity of the illness. You can use that using the table and scale, but you don't have to specify with that. Some of the things that help us understand that schizoaffective is different than schizophrenia is that it doesn't necessarily need to have that functional impairment that schizophrenia has. It also doesn't necessarily need to function those negative symptoms, the lack of wanting to do anything, the lack of enjoying things, or the lack of wanting to socialize. The course of schizoaffective disorder is usually gentler on the person than schizophrenia. Periods of remission are more likely to occur. It also has worse treatment outcomes than, say, major mood disorders like bipolar or major depressive disorder. And it's important to keep in mind that if those mood components fall away, that the person might be re-diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And if those psychotic symptoms fade away to a point, they might be re-diagnosed with a major mood disorder. Like schizophrenia and the rest of the spectrum, schizoaffective does have an increase in genetic risk if you're related to someone with schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia. It does have similar trends in suicidality as schizophrenia. Schizoaffective disorder is different than schizophrenia in that there are major mood elements that are present throughout the acute portions of the illness. Likewise, major mood disorders are different from schizoaffective disorder because psychotic symptoms exist outside the parameters of major mood disturbances. And like schizophrenia, there is a lower life expectancy for schizoaffective disorder. And that can be due to poor health habits like eating, lack of exercise, lack of medical visits, and an increased prevalence of substance abuse. Now we're getting into the other psychotic disorders. These are psychotic disorders maybe caused by things that aren't purely psychological. And we'll start with substance or medication-induced psychotic disorder. This is the prevalence of delusions, hallucinations in the wake of using drugs, and double checking that these are materials that do cause psychotic symptoms. Making sure that this isn't some other purely psychological disturbance. So tracking that the substance was taken before the onset of psychotic symptoms. You want to rule out delirium as the cause of these psychotic symptoms as well. Lastly, these disturbances need to make a significant impairment on the person's function level or their ability to get along in life. Now, mind you, this is different than simply being intoxicated because the hallucinations or delusions are the primary component that's causing the function level to be diminished. There is a big table that helps the clinician code exactly what kind of illness this is. It basically revolves around what sort of substance has induced psychotic behavior. You also want to track if the person has a use disorder, mild, a use disorder, severe or moderate, or no use disorder. You also want to specify if the psychosis occurred during intoxication or during withdrawal. Like the other disorders, you can use a severity chart to track how severe each of the symptoms are. This diagnosis is different than the other ones because it has an organic cause, the drugs that the person took or the medication that they took. And the symptoms should remit after those drugs or medications are withdrawn from the person's bloodstream. However, not all cases remit. That could be because certain damages might be fully done by drugs, or because there's medications that the person simply can't stop taking. last among the disorders is psychotic disorder due to another medical condition. This is basically referring to someone having psychotic symptoms due to a physiological issue. If you ever watched Grey's Anatomy, you might remember Katherine Heigl's character suffered a brain tumor that caused her to see Jeffrey Dean Morgan and make out with him, until one day she realized he was a tumor and he disappeared. This diagnosis features the same delusions and hallucinations that you would see in other psychotic behaviors. The difference is the etiology, the cause. In the course of lab work or physical examination, someone has discovered a medical reason that might be causing the psychosis. There are endocrine disorders, metabolic disorders, different sorts of neurological disorders. All of that can cause delusions and hallucinations. These all require physiological examination or lab work to discover the origins of this. There really isn't a lot else to say psychologically about what's going on here. Most of the remission revolves around treating the underlying medical condition. Usually that helps these conditions go away, but in some cases the damage can be done, or rather there is no treatment for the medical condition and that the person will continue to experience these psychotic episodes for the remainder of their life. Okay, so now that we know all the different diagnoses that are inside schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, let's see if we can make a diagnosis of our own. Let's take a look at case study number 3, increasingly odd. Gregory Baker was a 20-year-old African-American man who was brought to the emergency room, ER, by the campus police of the university from which he had been suspended several months earlier. The police had been called by a professor who reported that Mr. Baker had walked into his classroom shouting, quote, "I am the Joker and I am looking for Batman." When Mr. Baker refused to leave the class, the professor contacted security. Although Mr. Baker had much academic success as a teenager, his behavior had become increasingly odd during the past year. He quit seeing his friends and spent most of his time lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. He lived with several family members but rarely spoke to any of them. He had been suspended from college because of a lack of attendance. His sister said that she had recurrently seen him mumbling quietly to himself and noted that he would sometimes at night stand on the roof of their home and wave his arms as if he were, quote, conducting a symphony. He denied having any intention of jumping from the roof or having any thoughts of self-harm, but claimed that he felt liberated and in tune with the music when he was on the roof. Although his father and sister had tried to encourage him to see someone at the university's student health office, Mr. Baker had never seen a psychiatrist and had no prior hospitalizations. During the prior several months, Mr. Baker had become increasingly preoccupied with a female friend, Anne, who lived down the street. When he insisted to his family that they were engaged, Anne told Mr. Baker's sister that they had hardly ever spoken and certainly were not dating. Mr. Baker's sister also reported that he had written many letters to Anne but never mailed them. Instead, they just accumulated on his desk. His family said that they had never known him to use illicit substances or alcohol, and his toxicology screen was negative. When asked about drug use, Mr. Baker appeared angry and did not answer. On examination in the ER, Mr. Baker was a well-groomed young man who was generally uncooperative. He appeared constricted, guarded, inattentive, and preoccupied. He became enraged when the ER staff brought him dinner. He loudly insisted that all of the hospital's food was poisoned and that he would only drink a specific type of bottled water. He was noted to have paranoid, grandiose, and romantic delusions. He appeared to be internally preoccupied, although he denied hallucinations. Mr. Baker reported feeling, quote, bad, but denied depression and had no disturbance in his sleep or appetite. He was oriented and spoke articulately, but refused formal cognitive testing. His insight and judgment were deemed to be poor. Mr. Baker's grandmother had died in a state psychiatric hospital where she lived for 30 years. Her diagnosis was unknown. Mr. Baker's mother was reportedly crazy. She had abandoned the family when Mr. Baker was young, and he was raised by his father and paternal grandmother. Ultimately, Mr. Baker agreed to sign himself into the psychiatric unit, stating, quote, I don't mind staying here. Anne will probably be there, so I can spend my time with her. Go ahead and give yourself a moment to diagnose Mr. Baker. Pause the video and come back, and I'll give you my diagnosis. Mr. Baker appears to have either schizophrenia or schizophreniform disorder. And this comes down to the timeline that we're presented. It says several months. If it said more than 6 months, I would definitely go with schizophrenia. But because it says several months and we can't say for sure, I think it's safer to say schizophreniform and that we are waiting for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. There are many symptoms of psychosis present. Hallucinations and delusions are very prominent. He has delusions of being in love with Anne. He thinks people are trying to kill him with poison. He thinks that he has to drink a specific kind of water. He says things that are bizarre, like, I'm Batman and I'm looking for the Joker. He's clearly hallucinating and mumbling to himself because he's experiencing internal stimuli, but he's denying his illness. That's another sign of schizophrenia. His avolition is very present. He's not interested in doing college anymore. He wasn't even interested in mailing those letters to Anne. So that's another point for schizophrenia. But again, we don't have the timeline as perfect as maybe we would need it. He doesn't have a history of drug use, and his toxicology report came up negative. So there's no reason to suggest that there's a substance issue here. Our client here seems to be having a fairly significant impact on his function level. He's no longer enrolled in school and hasn't been doing much of anything except couch surfing with relatives. So far, this case study has made very little mention of mood swings, so it doesn't seem like that's a very predominant feature of the symptoms. Lastly, our client does not seem to have any kind of history of autism. His family didn't mention anything. Even if he did, his psychotic symptoms like hallucinations and delusions are clearly very present. He does have a history of immediate relatives with some form of mental illness, called crazy for his mom, and we do know that his grandmother spent 30 years in a state psychiatric facility. She may have had a diagnosis of one of the Schizophrenia Spectrum disorders. Hopefully this case study gave us a little bit more to think about. Thanks everybody for watching this video here, and thank you Professor Jones for letting me make a video instead of doing a PowerPoint. That's it for now, guys. I'll see you in class.